Thank you, Deputy Speaker. I rise to speak on the Carbon Farming Initiative Amendment Bill, the centrepiece of the government's Direct Action Plan. Now, we know that this bill will deliver on the Coalition's commitment to establish an emissions reduction fund, providing positive incentives to reduce emissions in place of the punitive carbon tax put in place by the previous government. Of course, the objective of this exercise is to reach our bipartisan target of a 5% reduction on year 2000 emissions. Now, Deputy Speaker, at a personal level, I've followed developments in climate science for over 25 years. Despite the blizzard that has dumped snow on the mountains just south of here, where I was brought up, I have watched, Deputy Speaker, the climate changing. I have watched the snow line rise, and I believe firmly that our best bet is that human activity is at least partly responsible. And I firmly believe that the world needs to act. But over 25 years, I have also watched developments in climate policy, and I have come to recognise, somewhat reluctantly at times, that overly aggressive and poorly directed unilateral action by any country is meaningless and futile. Overly aggressive and poorly directed action presents two fundamental problems for Australia. First, we risk trashing our economy for absolutely no reason. And second, we ignore the fact that the fundamental problem is one of reducing carbon emissions globally, not domestically. The atmosphere makes no distinction between carbon emitted from the US, China, Australia, Africa or anywhere else in the world for that matter. We know, Deputy Speaker, that we are a long way from an international deal on this issue. In fact, the whole spectre of Copenhagen taught us a great deal, and above all it taught us that getting to a global agreement was going to be extremely difficult, far more difficult than many thought it was going to be. In fact, a wonderful piece written by the former advisor to the former Prime Minister, Kevin Rudd, a guy called Andrew Charlton, laid out very clearly the extraordinary challenge the world faces in coming to a global agreement, a challenge which those on the other side of the House seem to ignore in taking their positions that they do on this issue. Now, Deputy Speaker, often all of this is presented as a choice between progress and planet. A choice between progress and planet. I don't believe we need to make this choice. Progress versus planet is the narrative of the Green Revolutionaries, but the history of humanity is one of reconciling progress and planet. The two can and should live together. So the issue here for the Coalition and for me personally is not the target, because that is a bipartisan target, but the means of getting there. And of course, the comparison needs to be made in context. So let's look at the critical characteristics of the Australian economy in thinking about this problem. First of all, and perhaps most importantly, our exports are extremely emissions intensive. Those from the other side of the House and elsewhere like to quote our carbon emissions per capita. What they forget to quote is the extraordinary emissions intensity and energy intensity of our exports. And amongst them are aluminium, alumina, coal, cement, fertiliser and the full range of agricultural products. And it seems to me that those opposite are very quick to ignore the importance of these industries to Australia, their historical importance and unquestionably the future importance of these industries to our great country. The second characteristic of the Australian economy that those opposite ignore is the emissions intensity of our electricity grid, So we emit about 0.9 tonnes of carbon per every megawatt hour of electricity. It's high by global standards, and that level is actually a measure of the dominance of coal in our grid and the competitive advantage we have created as a country by having low-cost coal and low-cost energy. Now, because of those characteristics of the Australian economy, The reality is that reducing carbon emissions is challenging and risks being expensive. It's an expensive place to reduce carbon emissions, particularly in our electricity grid. Cheap coal, of course, is a big contributor to that, but increasingly we know that expensive gas is an important component of that as well. Across the world, countries are coming to the conclusion the fastest way to reduce carbon emissions is to swap coal for gas. And of course in Australia, with so much of our gas being exported and our gas price being determined by the international price, that's a very expensive thing for us to do.